Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome, everyone. We're really pleased to have all of you on the call today. We have a really wonderful set of guests, and we're very much looking forward to a very global conversation today. So let's move ahead, Zeta. All right, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute for Corporate Productivity, better known as I4CP, we are a research organization that's dedicated and focused on discovering the people practices that drive high performance. So the focus of all of our research is really getting an understanding of what the practices are that high performing organizations implement that really differentiate themselves from their competitors. And how do we define high performance? Well, with every study that we do, we ask a series of questions. This is our high performance index. We ask organizations to tell us how they're doing in these 4 key areas over a 5-year period. And that's the index that we use to filter and sift through our data to make determinations about practices of high and low performers. And this is just a snapshot. This is not all of our members, but this is what I like to call our Constellation of Stars. These are many of the companies that are part of the I4CP community. So we do research on their behalf, and all of these organizations participate very closely with us on crafting our research and figuring out what it means once we close our surveys and we're looking at the data. So welcome members and guests alike. So Mark, my co-pilot, I would like to introduce Mark. Go ahead and say hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of our TA work. I did post in chat just a welcome, and also please share your name, what organization you're with, as well as what location. Our guests, at least one of them, is not on the continental United States, which I love that fact, and we'll share more here. I'd also just tee up quickly that we have regular calls happening weekly. One in the chat already mentioned our session yesterday on top trends. So thank you, David, for doing that. We also have things that you see up on the screen happening next week, getting hybrid teamwork and collaboration right with Rob Cross. We have a strategic HR session that following week with the Chief People Officer at CPSI, and then we'll continue our rotation on getting hybrid work right with a leader from LinkedIn. So exciting things that continue to cross our paths and that we can share with the network as we continue to work forward. So great to see everyone, and we're looking forward to a very engaging call.
Thanks, Mark. So before we do our formal introductions, we want to get a baseline from everybody on the call. We're asking this question during all of our events and conversations this month about culture. And I want to just give you a little bit of context in terms of what we mean by a healthy culture. Do we have that slide, Zeta, on the Healthy Culture Index?
No.
Okay, all right. So how do we define healthy culture? Well, this is an index that we created with our ongoing research on culture that ended up finally with a book by our CEO, Kevin Oakes, Culture Renovation. But what we figured out with our data analysis is that high-performing organizations that have healthy cultures have the same markers. They're highly collaborative, they're highly innovative. People feel a very strong sense of belonging. There's connection to the mission and the culture of the organization. So that's the context of this poll question. How would you describe your organization's culture at this moment today? And this data that we're gathering this month is really helping to inform a follow-on culture study that we're doing this year on culture toxicity and how organizations can really work to turn that steamer around for sure. So, okay. So this is pretty similar to the outcome we had yesterday on our quarterly research briefing. Similar findings in terms of how people are rating their culture. It's good to see very healthy and somewhat healthy. Okay. And it's great to see that no one is saying that culture is very toxic. Okay, thanks everyone. So also just a reminder to everyone that our conference in Scottsdale, Arizona. Registration is open for this. We have just finished posting a whole series of videos of all of the presentations and talks from our 2022 conference. A lot of really incredible speakers, authors, researchers, and leading executives on a really wonderful variety of topics related to HR and talent management. So I4CP members, don't miss that opportunity to check out those presentations. They're all on the site now. Okay. And our latest major study, the Talent Imperative, we did this with Fortune Media. Really proud of this study, and our lead researcher, Catherine Brecken, has really been on a virtual tour talking about this research. And so if you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, this is also available on our site to download. Okay, so let's get to the good stuff. One of the reasons why Mark and I lead this call every month is because we both sit with our talent acquisition board. So I4CP has 6 functionally focused boards to include a CHRO board, a Chief Diversity Officer board, People Analytics board. Mark and I work with the talent acquisition board. So we're very, very fortunate to work with people like Andrea and her colleague, Jason. But just a little background, Andrea is based in Bratislava, Slovakia. And she's the global head of talent acquisition at Mondelēz International. We'll hear a little bit more about Mondelēz. Jason Narlock, her colleague, is based in Chicago, and he's the head of people insights and analytics. And prior to joining Mondelēz, he held a couple of leadership positions at PepsiCo and Mercer. So welcome, Andrea and Jason.
Thank you very much, Lori.
Yes, we're going to talk all things global talent acquisition and analytics and all the things that go along with it, because it's a shared story, right? Talent acquisition, analytics, diversity, equity, inclusion, all the things. So let's get going.
Yeah, these are Mondelēz International. You know, some of you might not know the company, but these are our brands, and some of those you might recognize from many of them are in the United States available, and some are just more international, but that's gives you a sneak peek of the portfolio that we have. So chocolate and biscuits is what we are selling and manufacturing and producing. And today I'm actually in Zurich, which is our regional head office for Europe, but originally I'm from Austria. So that's why I have this strange accent.
Love it.
If you move us forward, here you can see our purpose is to help people snack right, and we have about 80,000 employees around the globe. We have made 3 acquisitions earlier this year, or announced them, so this will be growing. We are selling in 150 countries and also manufacturing in 127. Most of those plants are in Europe. We are organized in 4 regions: North America, Latin America, EMEA, so Asia, Middle East, and Africa, and Europe. We have about 29 billion of revenue, and the biggest revenue contributing market is Europe, with close to 40%, 30% North America. And then you can also see at the right how the portfolio is split: almost 50% from biscuits, 30% chocolate, and then we still have gum and candy, as well as a little bit of cheese and grocery. Since 2012, when we spun off from Kraft Foods, in the international business, we still own the license for Philadelphia cream cheese. And beverages is especially in the emerging markets with Tang. In the bottom, you can see we are #1 market share for biscuits globally. Oreo is contributing to that, largely a cookie that's over 100 years old. And then we are #2 in chocolate. Cadbury, Milka, Toblerone. These are the brands in that area.
It's an interesting business, Andrea, and I imagine that the talent that underlies all of this to operate in 150 countries has some huge impact to your TA organization. Maybe take that next slide and show us the big picture of your TA organization as you represent it across the globe.
Yeah, and we are actually operating in 13 business units. They shared the 4 regions, but actually in these 13 business units, this is where we have the accountability for the respective P&Ls. So you see, we're starting in the West, Canada and the US. In Latin America, in some parts of the world, it's a single country like Brazil, like Mexico, like China, like India. And then in other parts, it's a cluster of countries like Southeast Asia or Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Sub-Sahara Africa, or WACAM, kind of Central America. And my team, I have a leader in each of these business units, because from a people or HR point of view, but as well from a TA perspective, we are mirroring the business. We're in service of the business. And then on the very right-hand side, you also see in the red boxes, there's a team that is not directly reporting to me, but in service of me, who is looking after process and technology with TA excellence roles that are servicing the different markets, but mostly, as you can see, located in the UK, because obviously Europe operating globally is kind of the sweet spot. Australia needs to join early morning calls and then late evening calls, sorry. And then Costa Rica and Mexico more the early morning calls.
Yeah, so as we go to the next slide, you really, I think, summarize well the moving parts that you have in terms of the size of the team, how many hires you do annually. Are there any other things that you would highlight here when you're talking about 17,000 hires a year? Some of the big pieces that it would be helpful for folks to know?
Sure. So we have, in order to service or to hire these 15, 17,000 people around the globe, I have a team of 300. So we have an in-house recruiting team that is partially onshore in the country in order to make sure we have the market proximity, the business intimacy, but we nevertheless, also from a cost point of view, we are operating out of 3 shared service centers. In the UK for Europe, in Costa Rica servicing North America and Latin America, and in the Philippines for the EMEA market. And we are servicing on a geography base. So basically where the vacancies exist, this is the team that is recruiting for these roles. But you can imagine we also have a global organization like procurement, like RD&Q, and they also want an interface into TA. And for this, we have set up so-called key account managers role, so that we are helping or IT, where it's basically, it doesn't matter where folks sit. It's more the skill set and the capability that we need to hire. We have dedicated sources and recruiters. We own TA advisors or recruiters and coordinators. Our tech stack is Workday, as well as ServiceNow for case management. Workday, we operate in 14 languages, which obviously when you think about contracts, etc., and providing all of these, we need to make sure that we have all of this native language capability as well. And then Avature as a CRM.
It's a lot of moving parts. And before we introduce Jason, and I know there's a huge need here, is Andrea, your background, is it in TA?
No. No. Although I have been for the company for a very long time, I spent the first 10 years of my career in manufacturing before I did a cross-functional move into HR. Have always been in HR operations role before. Then 2 years ago, I moved into TA and learned that trade skill.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting piece, I think, getting to know TA leaders who have grown up in TA or have a different path like yourself, which you are more rare, but it's an interesting moment to see how that strength is leveraged of understanding the business. But when Lori and I think about this complexity, there's such a high need for the data analytics component of it. And I'm sure this is part of the reason why you partner with Jason so closely. So Jason, how about you introduce yourself and share a little bit more about your kind of role at Mondelez?
Yeah, sure. Well, hey, everybody. Name's Jason. I head our People Insights and Analytics team. I'm based in Chicago. Obviously, you can tell this doesn't look like Chicago. I'm back home in Minnesota for a few weeks, enjoying summer before the snowflakes fly. But, in short, my team are the proud number nerds for HR. So we're the statisticians, the labor economists, all those folks. Lori, I see the thumbs up, right? We're a rare breed. We make poor dinner guests, but we do like to play with numbers and tell stories. And I think, Zeta, if we go to the next slide, Andrea and I would really like to tell a story about some of the TA challenges that we see Mondelez facing over the next couple of years. And any story that we create, Andrea and our teams, we work together through data to tell those stories through a suite of products or dashboards that we have been leveraging with all 300 of Andrea's teammates. So let me give you a little bit of data, and then Andrea will get to the really interesting stuff in about 2 minutes. When we think about the Great Resignation or voluntary turnover here at Mondelez, the long story short is the Great Resignation wasn't all that great for Mondelez. If we look at our historical turnover rate from 2017 onwards, our voluntary turnover rate was roughly within historical norms. We didn't see a huge increase in turnover. And if we look at our forecast for 22, we're going to be pretty close to where we were in about 2019 in terms of our voluntary turnover, as far as our forecast concerned. So we didn't see the uptick in turnover that I think a lot of folks on this call probably saw in their companies or their parts of the business world. However, I don't think we're out of the woods. If we jump to the next slide, other data that we've been looking at is, how we compare to our peers. Our turnover rate, we've done roughly better at Mondelez than our CPG peers, the PepsiCos, the Unilevers of the world. But as you can tell, this has ticked up a little bit. So like I said, we're definitely not out of the woods. CPG overall didn't see a huge increase in turnover relative to other parts of the business world, but nevertheless, there were some issues. The real issue, I think, is on the next slide. So while our voluntary turnover really wasn't an issue, and it hasn't been at least through today, what we are seeing are some macroeconomic and demographic changes that are having a big impact on the supply side of the talent equation. So while folks might not be leaving at any higher rates than they have in the past at Mondelez, the supply of workers in a lot of our key markets is going down. On the left-hand side, just showing here our quit rate in the United States. Yes, we talked a lot about, folks leaving in the US. That started to plateau a little bit, especially over the last couple of months. And we're seeing the same trends in other countries like Australia and the UK, for instance. So labor volatility is something we need to be worried about. What's really fascinating, though, is if we look at the labor force participation rate, there's been a lot of keystrokes used to describe this in the US. Workers left during COVID, they haven't returned. What we're seeing is that this isn't just happening in the United States. It's happening in countries like the Philippines, for instance, where we have a very large back office support team. It's happening in countries like Vietnam, which we really didn't expect that happening. Even demographic changes in countries like China are creating a lot of challenges for us to compete with a smaller and smaller pool of labor. Take into account the fact that globally we have a very low growth environment. Not a lot of countries are growing in terms of their GDP, and yet inflation is high and labor force participation is low. So we're not growing. That affects our net revenue opportunity. It affects our margins, which shareholders are really concerned about. And at the same time, it's creating pressures for Andrea's team and the Total Rewards team to try to attract talent and hold on to them. So while turnover is not a huge issue for us, anytime someone leaves, it's that much more work to hold on to folks. And we see this external data. If we go to the next slide, we see this reflected in our dashboards. And this is the type of data that we really work with Andrea's team to tell those types of stories for the business to drive results. The top line that you're seeing here, these are our frontline core manufacturing, our frontline workers. The green line here is our hire count, how many people we're hiring each month. And then our blue line here is how many of those workers were hired within our service line agreement. Well, what are we seeing? Volume goes up, our SLAs are going down. Compare that to our professional hires where, volume has been going up. We're hiring more professionals, we're growing as a company, but we're able to hire those folks within our service line agreements. We're able to hire them within the time that we promised the business that we'll hire them. So I think the whole story here is turnover, not a huge issue. Macroeconomic challenges are creating issues on the supply side of the equation. And where we're really seeing the challenges are in our front line. So we provided this great challenge and want to hand it back over to Andrea because we've been trying some really interesting techniques to try to grab that, get a bigger share of that smaller pool of the frontline workforce. And I think that's the really cool part of this story. So Andrea, I'll hand it back to you.
Before we do that, and I love the transition because I think you're right on that the data not only tells a story, but also focuses your attention on options for action that we're going to get into. But everybody or many people on the call, I think, are clamoring around, okay, what's the tech behind this? And my guess is, and just you've got Workday and you mentioned Power BI as two kind of bullet points in a preceding slide. Can you give us just 30 seconds around how this comes together?
Yeah, sure. It's not all Workday. So we're definitely not, we're not trying to sell Workday here. Workday is great as a system of record, Mark. It's terrible when it comes to actually showing data. And as Andrea was saying, it's not just Workday data that we want to bring in. We want to bring external labor market data in. We need to bring data in from Avature. So we find Power BI working really close with our IT departments to set up architecture that combines all that data together is really helpful. And then for us, we like Power BI because we use Teams. Folks can click through the Teams interface to get dashboards, to get that information. Maybe one final call out, you can have the coolest dashboard in the world, but unless your folks, your teams are enabled to use that information and tell stories and take action, it's not very helpful. So the other thing that we work a lot on is just training folks on how to use all this information.
That was my next question, Jason, is how widely are you sharing this data? Who has access to it?
Yeah, I mean, we are pretty democratic when it comes to this type of data. We feel that we want to empower everyone in talent acquisition to see this information and take ownership. And that's not just in HR, that's a company-wide initiative that I think our CEO has done a good job of encouraging. So we want to, Lori, I think to your question, the more folks that can see this, use it, I think the better off we'll be as a company.
Excellent, thanks.
All right, so Andrea, now we get to the pilots and some of the things you were testing on the next slide to kind of walk us through. You've got data, and now you're there.
I just want to add some more thing, because the other thing that Jason's team is also doing, besides building the dashboard and bearing with us of what we need and which other features we want to have, is also educating the team on TA analytics, because this is a muscle that is not so well developed in my team. So therefore, in his team, he has basically both capabilities, and we invested a lot of time in also upskilling, but also staying with the team. It was on the prior slide, I said, we have like bi-weekly sessions where the teams can practice, and Jason's team continues to give feedback in the spirit of making the story even better because obviously it comes with practice and also mutual learning, and learning from each other, because the challenge is sometimes it's in finance and sometimes it's in sales. Also, yesterday we talked the challenges we have in the India sales team, but you can, of how you are double clicking and generating the insights and combining the internal data plus the external data, leveraging LinkedIn Talent Insights or whatever other data we have access to, makes the story even more robust. And then the call to action or the so what is stronger. So that's, yeah, this is just very important as well, right? Because it's not done with a one-off training session. To continue to work on it and evolve it. It's a journey. So you can clearly, hold on, just go back again. Let me just explain the core manufacturing. And we have a very, you can see, we are hiring thousands of people in this frontline area. And this is the US, where we have a very our distribution model is direct store distribution. That means our cookies and chocolate on the shelves is stacked by our very own people. And this is where in parts of the world, in parts of the states, we are struggling to actually fill those roles, yeah, which are key, because unless we sell the cookies, you know, we, at the end of the day, one of the most important roles that we have. So therefore, we have tried different things. And what I wanted to share with you, what based on our experience worked and what didn't work. Yeah, we tried many things and many things didn't work. So I'd also be curious to know, for those of you on the call who have these type of roles as well, what have you tried and what worked for you? So now you can go to the next page, Saida. So we are using Indeed Apply, I didn't mention this earlier, and which works for us quite well. And we are planning to expand that because you see, we tried it with 90 slots initially towards the end of last year, and have extended close to 600 offers, and especially in these areas where we had openings for a long time. Yeah, you see here, 295 days, almost a year, where it was basically lots of overtime for other people who had to drive further in order to make sure that the stores are properly stocked with our products. So this worked for us very well, and subsequently we're expanding this for this year and also into next year. Then we tried virtual fairs in very specific areas. This didn't work for us very well. Yeah, I mean, from the people who signed up for interviews then actually showed up, and going through the funnels of the offers that we made until who actually then started. So you can see, out of the 19 offers made, half of them dropped out, and then additionally we had one no-show. So lots of effort that went in with limited success. On the other hand, you know, this is where you see we are trying to bring more people into the funnel, is on our very own process, because the targeted time to hire for these people is 46 days. So we are trying to make this as short as possible, but then we still had more than one interview, because our hiring managers and business wanted to have that, and had to do lots of convincing to try at least the pilot to go just for one interview, which then reduced the time to hire by 2 to 5 days. And therefore we are currently expanding that, because the thinking was, if we're not doing more than one interview, there's the risk that we're hiring somebody and we are not happy with their performance, and then need to go through all the performance management, and it's more hassle later on, which we were able to prove is actually not the case, as close to 90% of new hires were active after a month of being hired. I pause here, Mark. I don't know if there are any questions or builds.
I think one, you point out some interesting components to how do you design that one interview for not trying to, I guess, boil the ocean, but also get the results that will be most effective to make a decision? Are there very specific things that you have taught that interviewer or focused on to ensure that you are making quality decisions?
I mean, at the end of the day, the requirements for that role are very limited, right? So you basically, what we wanted to do is that it just is TA who is making the interview and the final call, yeah? And not take anyone's other's time up where scheduling and rescheduling, etc., comes into play.
So it's an important, you're trusting the TA expertise as opposed to the hiring manager. Is that an accurate picture?
Yes.
I love it. Do you also couple that with a technology screening to get to a specific set of people that they're interviewing? Somebody asked kind of what's the, are you using chatbots or what are you doing to just kind of enable some of that screening?
Yeah, we are not using chatbots. We would love to use them, and we actually have put some dollars into the budget for next year to get that, because clearly there's too much effort and manpower involved. Yeah. That I'd like to focus elsewhere, but we don't have that yet.
And just one more question. I'm still thinking about the slide that shows your global team. We did have a question about how many of those 300 people on your team, how many open recs do they have at a time? And also, you're not using RPO. It's totally internal, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, almost correct. For the last acquisition that we had in Europe, Chipita, which is baked croissant, single wrapped. You get them at the gas stations. This is where we needed to scale the team quickly. Yeah, we actually engaged an RPO of, I think, 8 or 10 people in order to manage that. We had the leadership team and the project management internal in order to make sure the governance and that works. But it's kind of an exception, yeah. So, but as a principle, we have an in-house recruiting team, yes. And the rec load at any given point of time, it depends. I would say, 25 is the tipping point. When anyone has more than 25, we say, okay, we need to help. And who has capacity? And this is the advantage of having a global team. Yeah. We currently have challenges in Canada, so the US as well as Middle East and Africa is actually helping and leveraging, following the sun model, because while they're sleeping, still people who have the right skill set can do the sourcing out of the Middle East.
That's excellent. Yeah. So, Andrea, you ask and you shall receive. Liliana from MasterCard, could you come off and share a little bit about what you have been doing around the accelerated hiring? It sounds similar, but maybe a little bit of a tweak.
Yeah, I was really happy to hear, Andrea, that you were using a similar method. At the beginning of the year, we had a huge project at MasterCard that required hiring approximately 700 to 750 people in about 8 months. We had not done something to that scale at MasterCard previously, and this was across 3 regions. So it was US, Europe, as well as India. And what we decided was to group the positions that belong to the same job families to find efficiencies. And those positions we would put through what we called an accelerated hiring. So we would have a technical interview, a hiring manager interview, and a new concept that we call bar raiser, who is somebody who can screen for cultural fit, communication skills, soft skills, is this a quality hire for MasterCard? And we would have these 3 interviews in a matter of 2 hours. So we created loops of interviews where we could handle in those 2 hours 4 candidates per loop, going through 2 hours of interviews each. And at the end of those 2 hours, the interview panel would gather and then tell us, the talent acquisition team, yes, it's a good hire. We recommend them at this level, you know, in this job family or this particular role. And we would go from there to offer stage. So what we learned was our conversion rate was anywhere between 65 and 70%. So of the 4 candidates that were interviewed in that loop, 2 to 3 of them would go to offer stage. We were able to close the time from interview to offer by about a week or so, because immediately after the interviews happened, the panel would get together, make a decision and a recommendation, and we would go ahead and go from to offer from there. We did have to tweak this a little bit. It was a new muscle that we were exercising, but we finally got to a good traction and we're able to close a lot of positions. So we're going to continue working with this methodology, especially around job families that are similar, and we can group and quickly go through.
Sounds fabulous. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So maybe we dive a little more into the examples that you shared, Andrea, in terms of, I think the next slide is a great piece around your sales hiring.
Yeah, then we tried next and did 3 very targeted campaigns. You see here to the right-hand side, Florida, Colorado, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, trust me, there's no problem with that. We wouldn't know country abbreviations in Europe, so you're all good.
Yeah, you know, generating only 8 leads. You know, again, lots of costs, not so great. Then we tried QR codes on car magnets in different sales teams, also with limited responsiveness. You know, so I think there's also a problem with visibility. We would obviously our sales merchandisers are driving around, and we are talking about that we need to wrap the whole country or make it an Oreo cookie so that it is more visible. Also, Lori, you have asked me how our QR codes on the pack go, right? We had that as well, but we get actually more the consumer kind of complaints, you know, stale taste, broken cookies, that type of thing. Yeah, so this is, you see, we are trying things and some work, some don't work.
But I will say, in terms of the QR code usage with Mondelēz, I think your employer branding is brilliant in that I noticed on a box of Triscuits a couple of months ago that there was a QR code on there, but also like a little mini story about where the wheat was grown and who the farmer was. This is where your Triscuit came from. And I just thought, wow, that's genius. On so many levels, that's genius. So, but yeah, I would expect somebody who's eating some Oreo cookies sees that QR code. Hey, if you love these cookies, how would you like to make them? Join us. I'm really disappointed that that didn't go over as well as I thought it would.
That's, I would guess, part of the reason why you want to look at the data and try to innovate on multiple things. You know, it's kind of like, what do we think versus what happens are some really interesting pieces. So a question also came up around employee referral. Is that been an effective method for you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very effective. Yeah, that works very well.
Yeah. What are the incentives? Is it a lot of Oreos? I would like
no. It comes with money. It comes with money.
That's great.
Yeah, no, of course. And it is different. You know, there is a certain. It's actually related to our awards program, and so it's a percentage of what you earn.
Yeah, very good.
That's great.
No, but it's very effective, and we expand that, especially because we don't consistently use that yet around the globe. So we're expanding this everywhere. But in the US, it has been long established.
So why don't we go to the next slide? I think you got a couple of other ideas that you've tested, and TikTok has been an interesting
Yes.
kind of hot button. I'd love you to share more here.
Yeah, no, TikTok we used very successfully in Southeast Asia. You know, in the Asian markets, it's part of, you know, it's very dominant. So we also tried it in the US, and here you can see, and you can also see how the email blast that we use, and I will show you the video that we currently use, really short and promising, and we'll definitely continue to do that. Maybe Saida, you can play it.
No, I don't wait for tomorrow.
Thank you.
I love the idea of the TikTok. We interviewed SAP last year, and I think they found very much so that outside of the US, and I think you're exactly right that in Southeast Asia and some other markets like that, TikTok was one of their best sources of talent.
Yeah, exactly. So these are the things we tried, and we keep experimenting.
Yeah, well, it seems like that's right. And you know, part of I think what we wanted to do off of this was then build towards a little bit of a discussion around workforce planning. But before we get there, Zeta, you want to put up a quick poll, and we've got several things we want to end on here in terms of asking questions from the participants here. First, we'd love to hear, you know, just give us a quick read on the current capabilities for data analytics on your talent acquisition team. Is it a strength? Is it just across the select few, or this is a needs development area? We'd love to hear from you. And while we're waiting for the results, and we'll just leave this open about 60 seconds, Jason, I'll ask you this. How would you answer this in the TA team? No pressure, but you know, how would you rate the capability?
Yeah, no pressure when the boss at TA is virtually next to me, right, Mark?
Yes, sir.
Look, I mean, I think like within, across HR, I would say we do have pockets of good capabilities. There's other places where we need to, as Andrea said, build the muscle. The muscle's there. We just need to build it a little bit. One thing I will say, though, is I think we kind of are a little harsh on ourselves. Yeah, I see a needs development 60%. Mm-hmm. I'd say we're a little harsh on ourselves in HR. You know, when I talk to my counterparts in other companies or who are leading insights and analytics teams in marketing, for instance, they tend to have the same feeling. You know, our end users, we need to be building this capability. Our CHRO likes to talk about discipline. You know, how do we get folks to be more disciplined about how they use the analytics that are available to them? So I think the good news is the muscle's there. We just got to get to the gym, as it were, and then work it out a little bit more.
I just think the fact that you're sitting with these teams and doing continuous learning and collaborative collegial teaching, I just think that's phenomenal. And I don't know that that happens in every organization, but I think that's a great best practice.
Yeah, Lori, I'll be honest with you, in the beginning when I started here, the idea was not to have that much of a high touch. How could we efficiently kind of build this capability? And we learned very quickly that it actually, it does take work. It's not, as Andrea said, it's not just a training that you can deliver and magically folks are going to start using this information. So I think, for folks on the call, if having better analytics capability is something that is needed in the business, or that's what leadership is asking for, there's going to have to be an investment there, not just in the technology, but on the enablement side. And I think that's important to call out. This isn't easy, but I think we've been really happy with the results, especially in collaboration with the TA team and Andrea.
Yeah, and I would add relationships. It's also the relationship piece of it, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Sorry, Mark.
No, you're totally good. It's such a hot button, and I think it's a little bit of a, we don't want to set you up, but I think too many folks think that strength means they are data scientists, as opposed to they understand the story and connection of how to use the data, is likely a better bridge than, saying, let's build a, that as a crucial, they could run analysis type work. That's not the point of this.
Yeah, 100%. I think, Mark, you're absolutely right. It's how do you tell stories? I think that's key. And, talent acquisition is generally extroverted folks who are good at that stuff. So I think where we can provide some support is just taking that natural ability and just channeling it towards analytics. But you're absolutely right. We don't need more data scientists in the world.
Yeah, there you go. So why don't we flip to the next slide? I think there's some interesting ways that you think about workforce planning and how you then talk about it in different areas of your workflow.
Yeah. So workforce planning in our company is not such a strong muscle, but obviously I depend on this data in order to create or convert this into a hiring plan and making sure that I have the right TA capacity. Because what was very clear is that, especially last year, that the team was overwhelmed, that the effort to get through the hiring that is required needed to be normalized. Yeah. And this is where I actually spent the whole week with Jason together in order to basically make the case and show that we are under-resourced. So in order to avoid this going forward, we built a very simple table, as you can see here. What's the hiring volume from 21? What was the attrition? What's the revenue growth? What's the volume so far in the year? The extrapolation, the annualized attrition, and the prediction. And so these data came all from Jason's team. And then basically I just asked, what's the incremental headcount in your business unit for next year? And then putting this, then consolidating it and translating it into my budget, both for people as well as non-people, because as you all know, there's a non-people cost component as well if we're increasing the volume. And then what we need to do is then also monitor on a quarterly basis, because I have a actually quite significant increase. Yeah, I will increase my headcount by 12%. Based on the fact that the business is growing and needing more hires next year. But obviously it can go both ways, right? It could also decrease, and then I would also need to go take my capacity down. That's why these quarterly reviews, where then again, the dashboard, I have a separate tab on the capacity, right? Where we can see how we're doing, plan versus actual, and do we need to adjust something, is so important as well. So here we have another poll, Mark, right? Because I'd be curious to see how you are doing that. Do you use a tool, or do you also use Excel?
Yeah, we combined two questions into one, because I think there's some great things here, both from a tool standpoint, and then at the level of your detail, what are you requesting from your HR business partners as we think about the workforce planning data that they can supply back? So please take a few minutes. And it seems like, one, there's some varied tech that's out there that we're gathering. And I'd be curious, Andrea or Jason, to what extent are you having regular conversations with the HRBP team to really pull data together?
So the respective business unit TA leads, they have connections with them on a regular basis. So, but from a, obviously I on a global level, then at least on a quarterly basis, also make sure that what we need, that the supply and demand is in lockstep. But Jason, then on the other side, he has created other dashboards as well, especially focusing on D&I and people analytics that are relevant for us, that are more, we're actually more targeted for the business partner function, but at the end, it's also very helpful for us when we look at attrition, double clicking into a specific function, or early attrition within the first 12 months, where, you know, there could be also an issue with recruiting or onboarding. In order to look into that, looking into different dimensions and leveraging of what is existing. I don't know, Jason, how do you see it?
No, I think you covered it well, Andrea. You know, I think part of the challenge, you know, there was a question here about one of the challenges around workforce planning. I think it's, you know, workforce planning can be very mathematical. And I think what Andrea and I do together is very much, you know, what's the volume, how many, how many cases can a recruiter close? Okay, therefore, how many recruiters are we going to need? Okay, that's pretty mathematical. There's an equation for that. Workforce planning starts to get more into the art than the science. And that's where it's really important. I think the challenge for us is getting our HR business partners to really, in a consistent way, look at all of this different data, work with their respective leadership teams to have better insights about what the volume would be to feed back into these equations. And, you know, I think that's one of the priorities that we have into next year is how do we, again, build capabilities for HR business partners to help us with some of these assumptions. Because in the end, if the assumptions aren't great, the equation isn't going to tell us anything very helpful.
So when you look at the responses, and can we post that back up, Zeta, the responses from the poll, or share them? I thought it was interesting to see that it feels like it's all over the place in terms of what people are using from a tech standpoint, even though the predominant core HR system is Workday. It's you know, kind of on the bottom end of this is likely no surprise, but even most people's HCM you know, tech likely is the least you know, kind of use in here. Any thoughts when you see this data, Jason?
Yeah, well, look, I think there's nothing wrong with Excel. You know, I have colleagues that would say, you know, never use Excel, it's terrible. I think Excel is a good foundational data science tool in my mind. I think there are ways you can use Excel to make sure you have consistency in what you're looking at. I might have cut out a little bit there, sorry. But I think, you know, it's really about, as Lori was saying, building those connections and those relationships to have these conversations. If you can express what you need in data in Excel, by all means, you know, you don't need a fancy system to do that. I think that's great. So I guess my initial reaction, Mark, is Excel is perfectly fine. And we shouldn't be, you know, dazzled by some of these new workforce planning tools if the business is getting what they need in a more, from a more simplistic approach.
Yeah, fair enough. It feels like the second question becomes a little bit more impactful, especially as we start to think about the TA strategy, the workforce planning, and potentially the idea of internal movement across the organization, that more organizations are asking about the volume location as opposed to down at the bottom, the phasing and the capability. I'd love to hear more, Andrea, from your perspective. Why is this an important question even to, you know, pose, you know, to your thinking?
Yeah, you see that what we currently do is just volume and location, very basic, but obviously I'd love to have the phasing. When do I need all these 17,000 people in January? Obviously no, but where are the peaks, right? So that I can also plan the team accordingly, and then ideally also have the capability from a business strategy. You know, the business has aligned on line future fit capabilities. Ideally, we proactively source for them, and I know exactly where they are and when we need them, right? So that we can be more proactive about that and get out of this urgent and reactive. But we need to kind of see this is where I'd like to go, get to, but it's an evolution, and we can only go on to the journey together. But this is where, yeah, what I'd love to have.
I love what you said, especially around kind of if you're trying to plan out 3 to 5 years in terms of where you want to be versus what you can concretely do and act on today. That seems to be much more how you build strength across the system, especially when you're talking about such a large TA team, and fundamentals that you're trying to kind of move forward. Is that an accurate picture of your approach right now?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Laura, you were going to ask something?
I wasn't going to ask a question about this. I was going to say, I think we just have a few minutes left, very few minutes left. And I just wanted to switch gears for one moment and just share with you, or ask Andrea to share in the last few minutes that we have a little bit about what she's been doing the last several months, or what Mondelez has been doing. Can we advance the slide, Zeta? In terms of running talent acquisition in a conflict zone, so some of you may not be aware that Mondelez does have employees in Eastern Europe. And so Andrea has joined a call or two with Mark and I and the rest of the talent acquisition board from her car while she was helping to get some of her colleagues across the border into Poland. She's also shared some resources that Mondelez has put together based on their experience in Ukraine and responding in real time to helping their employees and their loved ones. Andrea, is there anything you're comfortable sharing with everybody on the call about that experience so far?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to the next page, because then you see our presence there. Yeah, for us in Eastern Europe, it's a very important market, and you can see how big it is. And in the Ukraine itself, we have close to more than 1,000 people. Yeah, and we have 2 manufacturing operations, and in Kiev we have our business unit, and one of the plants is actually in the eastern part, and it's not operational. But we tried to get all employees that wanted to leave. Not everybody wants to leave across the borders into Poland, Slovakia. And some of them who wanted to leave, they then applied to all sorts of jobs. So we said, from China to Canada. So we needed to make sure to kind of funnel that and also streamline that process. Yeah, because Workday is not fit for purpose when you're in a war situation. And we switched then to Telegram and actually Excel files that are sent around in order to make sure we have kind of a matching of skills available, and where do we have the need, and in which parts. Most of them stayed in Europe, right? Because it was easiest. But what we also realized is that it was very important that we skill up our TA employees to actually have a very empathetic career conversation. Yeah, because it is, are you safe? Where are you? Where do you want to go? Some people had relatives elsewhere, some were totally open, but it also meant this was not an interview. It needed a lot more empathy, and therefore we created that guide and made sure people could have that connection with a recruiter and sign up for these type of career coaching conversations where matching was made in order to meet the need that was available. And we created a little guide, and I think that's also available on I4CP for everyone to leverage.
Yes, we have posted it to the website. Thank you for sharing that.
Very welcome.
Well, that was a fast hour.
It
We're
was.
thrilled with the level of detail, and I love most of all your willingness to share both things that worked and things that didn't. This is about, kind of moving forward in growth mindset as much as anything in terms of how we get to the next end. And so we appreciate all that shared details in chat, the MasterCard example from Liliana, and especially Jason and Andrea for being willing to walk through a variety of things that are working both in TA and people analytics for Mondelez. So thanks very much for your work here, and we wish you continued success.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
both very much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on the next channel.
Take care.
Be well.